All right, hello. Um, Welcome to the second half of this last lecture, the last day's lecture on global climate change. We are continuing. We are trying to wrap up the "What Goes Up" article from The Economist. We finished the last lecture by talking about responsibility. So this is the section on equity page on the third page of the article. And before I get into some more of the equity that they're talking about, we need to talk a little bit about in terms of responsibility of the crisis. In the U.S., I showed an animation talking about the U.S. being by far the world's largest cumulative emitter. Here we've got the U.S. has emitted almost 400 gigatons of carbon dioxide, and the next closest country is China at just over 200. So we're almost 2 times larger than the next closest emitter. All right, but the article also talks about equity in a different way, and I want to kind of highlight this kind of juxtaposition here between the equity, this responsibility for the crisis, and how much carbon we've put into the atmosphere, versus where some of these risks are expected to be from changing climates. And here's just one article looking at agricultural risk from climate to various areas of the world, and you can see that these areas highlighted in yellow and red are the areas where where there's expected to be fairly high risk to agriculture due to climate change. You can see it's not in America, right? Here's America, almost no risky areas, relatively speaking, compared to Africa and India, and balance this with responsibility, and I think that's interesting, or problematic. A second kind of aspect of equity is this concept of intergenerational equity, which is really fairly new on this kind of climate change discussions. It's been pushed in large part by Greta Thunberg, a Swedish activist. Okay, and I've just chosen out a clip, a section of an article talking about how it's kind of easy to see how this can be construed as a crime against children. And so you can read the rest of this, but basically there are rules or laws in place that guarantee people to a climate system capable of sustaining human life. Or in this article by Treves, he looks at all these different countries in the world, and they look at their kind of constitutions and their laws and talk about to what, do those constitutions or laws expressly permit citizens to have to live with a healthy environment. And you can see that most of the countries there are in green, indicating that there are substantive or procedural rights of citizens to a healthy environment. You can see the countries in blue, like China and India, which contain a lot of the world's populations, have a government duty. So that means that the government has a duty to provide a healthy environment to their citizens. And the U.S. there is in beige. Okay, so I wanted to kind of juxtapose these situations of equity related to versus kind of the responsibility. All right, so then kind of the rest of the article kind of talks mostly about mitigation and adaptation. And so what do these two these two kind of key phrases, key words mean? All right, so mitigation is to alleviate or reduce severity of climate change by reducing greenhouse gas emissions. Right? In normal kind of daily use, you might use the word mitigate. Right? So mitigation in this context is reducing the severity of climate change by reducing our greenhouse gas emissions now. Okay, right? So maybe switching some of our electrical plants, that run on coal to run on renewable energy, right? We'd be putting out fewer emissions, that would help reduce or alleviate the climate change severity in the future. Okay, so that's an example of mitigation. Adaptation, on the other hand, is trying to kind of adapt or change to the circumstances, right? It's adapting to the circumstances of climate change. So in this context, adaptation means to pursue strategies that cushion ourselves from the shocks of climate change. Okay, and one example might be building seawalls or barriers or other infrastructure that help to prevent or reduce damage from rising sea levels. So low-lying cities like Miami or New York City, or countries like Bangladesh or Pacific Island nations are having to kind of invest in infrastructure to try to, either physically raise them up off the ground or improve the infrastructure so that water drains more easily or prevent it from coming in the first place. Lots being done there. But adaptation can also relate to like things like agriculture and trying to increase the amount of carbon, in soils, so that they're more, they can tolerate higher levels of rainfall or higher temperatures or things like that. So you're adapting your crops to a new or changing climate, things like that. Okay, and so the idea here is that adaptation and mitigation, it must not be an either or. It has to be both. We need to be doing both of these things to address climate change here. In terms of mitigation, so how do we get there? How do we try to kind of accomplish this supertanker U-turn challenge, right? How do we drastically reduce our emissions? An older approach to doing that was Pakala and Sokolow in 2004, and then updated by Ram in 2008. And they had these things called stabilization wedges. And you can see some of the different things that they represented. So say if we converted, if we converted a number of coal plants, 800 gigawatt sized coal plants, and we captured the carbon and permanently stored it underground somehow, that would have that level of effect on our kind of overall emissions trajectory, right? And so you can see then here all these other options. There's a kind of an updated paper to these stabilization wedges by another Jacobson from Stanford, not related. And he wrote a paper called Energy Roadmaps for 139 countries, and that I've also posted that on Blackboard for you to look at. And that talks about how countries can kind of get to these, to green their electricity portfolios and how they can reduce their greenhouse gas emissions. A few of my key points on mitigation. I would say that there are a few different things that I would kind of highlight. We need to address the large footprint of electricity generation, so we need to reduce the amount of greenhouse gases coming out of our electrical generating portion of the economy. So we need to increase the conservation, so the wise use of electricity and the efficiency of our systems, of our buildings, of our lights, of our everything. And then we also need to be changing the source of the electricity away from coal and even away from natural gas to renewables or even nuclear. We can't accomplish, in my opinion, I don't know that we can accomplish kind of our more of our greenhouse gas emission goals or these reduction goals without changing land use patterns, changing the way that we grow and develop the land. And we need to improve, and this relates to improving our transportation efficiency, right? We need to stop kind of urban sprawl. We need to reduce that. We need to increase kind of the density of our cities. And we need to, people need to ride mass transit more. We need to have fewer single occupancy vehicles. Another important point on mitigation is family planning. And this can, talking about population can be a touchy subject. but in the sense that every new person is going to has a fairly large carbon footprint. It's probably prudent to at least try to reduce the amount of unintended pregnancies. These are unintended pregnancies, are pregnancies that people don't want or aren't looking for, right? And the rates of unintended pregnancy can be really high, and so getting birth control and family planning to some countries to help reduce these unintended pregnancies would really help with kind of reducing population growth over time. And then a last point on mitigation is we need to protect the remaining wildlands and wild landscapes that we have. That includes forests and other habitats. Okay, in the interest of moving on. All right, in terms of kind of personal responsibility, this was an interesting graphic that showed kind of a number of different choices that you could make to try to limit your contribution to climate change. Most of the things that we kind of do on a daily basis have pretty low impact, right? But switching to a hybrid car or getting rid of cars altogether, going to a meatless diet are kind of more up here. And then not having a baby, reducing your family by one child, has an impact way up here, right? So this kind of speaks to that family planning point in the last slide. But far and away, kind of the most important thing here to do is vote, right? That's the most important thing here. Beyond all these different things, we need leadership and leaders who respect science. Okay, in terms of adaptation, I talked just briefly about this before and when I introduced it. But I mean, there are places in the U.S. that are going to have to adapt that are having to adapt right now to increasing sea levels. So cities like Miami, Florida, approved over $200 million in bonds for infrastructure to improve drainage and piping to remove these high tides and floodwaters from their streets. And this is going to be kind of an ongoing problem for them. But that's a problem that they can deal with. There are entire countries, like the island nation of Kiribati in the Pacific, that is basically going to be underwater in the coming decades, given the current trajectory that we're on, right? As sea levels rise, these low-lying nations and islands that are only a few feet or a few meters off of the current sea levels will basically become uninhabitable, and this is kind of an equity issue as well, I would argue. And just the last slide to kind of sum up our multi-day lecture and multi-day section topic on global climate change is this here. I want to make 3 points. One is that the data is clear. The data are clear. There is scientific consensus on the issue. Global warming is occurring, and it is man-made. The International Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, IPCC, consists of hundreds or thousands of scientists across the world with different specialties, and they come together and write these massive documents, these assessment reports, where it is they are consensus documents, meaning everybody on that agrees with with the statements there. So there is consensus. It is occurring, and global warming is man-made. Okay, and so climate change. My second point is that climate change is not causing just temperature increases, but a myriad of impacts. And you can go to that Climate Signals website. You can see all these dozens of different impacts that are being tracked, and you can kind of tie it back to this evidence, to these studies that are tracking the changes here. And then finally, Earth's climate has never been stable, but the change that we're seeing right now and the rapidity of that change is basically unprecedented. The impacts could be severe and most likely fairly difficult to reverse, with the possibility of many kind of feedback loops that aren't incredibly well understood. and I've run out of time.